Hi, and welcome to another fine edition of On the Spot. My name is Ronnie Wiley. To my left is Richard Stanley, a very good friend of mine. Richard, glad to have you on the show.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. Richard, one of the best guys that I know in life, period. A fabulous human being. Great to have you on the show. I didn't know this about you, that you have had books published.
I've been blessed to have 2 books published.
Yeah, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But when I first moved to Connersville back in 1987, I was a junior in high school, and my sister went to what was the junior high back then. And so whenever I talk about Connersville, and people assume that I went to the junior high school, and when they mention that I know you, they say, "Well, did you have Mr. Stanley, or did you get in trouble by Mr. Stanley?" Because I was always notoriously in trouble. And I say, "No, I didn't have that privilege." But so you started off in education.
That's right.
Yeah, but you didn't start here in Connersville, is that correct?
Well, I taught the second semester at New Palestine before I came here, and that was a teacher on maternity leave, and she decided to come back the next year, so I went job looking again. I found this, and we moved here, and we've been here ever since.
Yeah, and what year was it?
Came in 1960.
Wow, so 56 years you've been in Connersville. And so you were looking for a job. What made you stay in Connersville and not look elsewhere?
Well, I was impressed with the quality of the corporation, school corporation. He was, excuse me, he was a leader in the area, and still is, I think, but it was definitely an outstanding school corporation. Wow.
And so you taught social studies, if I correct?
I started 7th grade geography, and had lots of kids there. Eventually moved into 8th grade history also at the junior high, and I taught both of those subjects until I became an assistant principal.
Oh, so did you hand out the discipline?
Oh, yeah, did quite a bit.
Yeah, so back then they had the old,
occasionally.
They had the Board of Education that I was way familiar with when I was in school. When I was in junior high over in West Carrollton, Ohio, a guy by the name of Augie Herman was his name, and he was a big ex-football player, and he would always go, "Ronnie, let's do it the easy way." Oh, he let you up. Those were the days. So you were an administrator for how long?
28 years.
28 years. Oh my gosh. And you retired when?
I left junior high in 1995.
Wow.
And then I came back the next school year and ran the buses. Was in charge of the school buses. They needed some help on that. And so I did that most of the school year. And then the next school year, beginning in 1996, fall of 96, I went to Temple Christian and taught 4 years.
Oh wow, yeah. When that was a great school, great addition to the Fayette County kids. And you taught there for 4 years. You taught the same subjects.
Taught several different subjects there. Yeah. Whatever was needed.
Whatever. So you were just a jack of all trades, right?
That's kind of right.
Wow, that's neat. That's neat. A lot of people that I talked to, I've had a lot of teachers. The thing that they remember the most, the kids. When you retired, how did you feel? I mean, you had this for 40 years.
Yeah.
How did it feel to retire?
Well, it was a lot of responsibility off, but I enjoyed. I missed the kids. I missed the other teachers. And and so I had a good time while I was doing it, but it was time to change.
Yeah. Very active at our church, Grace United. Busy with the pantry. When a lot of people, when they retire, I've heard a lot of people say this: "I'm busier now than ever."
I've found that I keep very busy.
Yeah. What are some of the hobbies that you have now?
Well, my main hobby through almost all of my life has been automobiles and collecting automobile literature. And that started when I was 9 years old in 1945, at the end of World War II. And I lived in Des Moines, Iowa at that time, my family. And as a 9-year-old, I would ride the bus downtown from school and get off the bus and walk home, stopping at automobile dealers along the way and getting literature.
Wow.
And that's something I still kind of amazed at as a little 9-year-old walking the streets in Des Moines, Iowa, and I didn't feel any danger, and my parents didn't seem to object, and so that's how I got started.
So what, I mean, was it just the look of the automobile or what the automobile represented to society that interests you in automobile literature?
Well, I don't know why the literature itself became so important. I was kind of slow getting started reading, and I got started with automobile literature, reading that, and learning some of the words that are not normal in other elementary books, and learning how to pronounce them, and so that became quite a benefit for me.
Sure, and I'm sure your parents were like, hey, whatever works, whatever works. One of the things I wish we would have done, being at your house, you just pretty much have a museum. This is an incredible, of the little cars, the model cars that you have.
I've got some die-cast.
Yeah, you have just, I mean, room full of literature on the history of cars, and you've actually have written some books.
I've been blessed to have 2 books published. Yeah.
When did you decide, you know what, I think I need to write a book?
Well, I never thought I would write a book because I didn't ever like to write.
Right.
But when I retired in 2000 from Temple Christian, that summer the library contacted me and said that they wanted to do a kind of a computer workup on materials related to Connersville cars. And so I went through, during the next several months, I went through their newspapers on microfilm and made a list of all the different car companies or parts companies in Connersville that related to the automotive industry. And I was impressed at the number of Lexington items that there were. And I thought there's never been a book written on Lexington. Now, there have been some articles written, but not a book. And so I decided I would try that. And so I started getting materials together and made contact. I was fortunate in making a contact with a representative from the McFarland Publishing Company. And he encouraged me to go ahead and publish, get the materials together, and I would submit them to him. The first time we submitted a written text, he said I had something like 40,000 words, but he wanted at least 66,000.
Oh, wow.
And so I had to go back and get more information on more people related to Lexington.
Wow.
And it took, I spent about 5 years off and on working on it, and until we got all of the material together and submitted it, and they gave me a contract. And so that was really a blessing. I did not have to self-publish.
Wow, that's good.
And
that's good.
Yeah, I was amazed.
So the Lexington, help me out with the history of the Lexington was made here in Connersville.
Yeah, actually it started in Lexington, Kentucky.
Okay.
And that's where the name came from.
Okay, makes sense.
The people that got the company together in trying to select a name for their car, they were real proud of the community, and so they named the car Lexington, and they even had land donated to put in a building, and they got going, but very soon they found out they didn't have anyways near enough space in their factory building, and they needed to enlarge the building, but they didn't have much room to enlarge where they were at, additional land area. And they're also, the company, the plant manager had a sister who lived in Connersville. And he made it known that that they were going to consider moving if they had the right proposition made. And we got together people in Connersville, and we committed to build them a new 2-story factory building if they would come here. And so they were just in Lexington, Kentucky over a year, and then they moved up here and they built cars here for about 15 years.
Wow. And they never thought about changing the name from the Lexington to the Connersville?
No, the name stayed because it was a popular name. The car established a good reputation, and they were pleased to continue the name.
Wow. You have some pictures in here.
Well, there's
that shows the design of the car. One thing that always amazed me back then is that cars, they always seem to have no roof. Was that common of any car back then?
The early cars were a carryover from the carriages and buggies, and most buggies did not have a top because a top made them heavier, and so you needed more horsepower or more horses if you were pulling a carriage with a top, and there were some that had, but the early cars were very much the same thing. They didn't have a top, or they had a folding top in this case, and the top could be folded in inclement weather. The windshield on this could be laid flat, or a lot of times they didn't even have a windshield to begin with.
Wow.
And people weren't accustomed to windshields in a buggy and a carriage, and so the early cars, people didn't feel the need to have the same thing. Some of the early cars didn't have doors, and people weren't accustomed to having a door on their buggy.
Yeah,
and so
that makes sense.
And so they were fine, but as the cars got going faster and faster,
you need to get a door.
You need to have safety, help keep you inside.
Because I've had a few bugs be squashed up.
Oh
yeah.
Yeah.
You don't want to be driving hitting that.
Yeah, the faster you go.
Yeah, the more you're going to squash those bugs.
Yes.
That's amazing. Wow. Now, where was the building? Is the building, correct me, I don't want to sound ignorant, but is the building still here that they built for the Lexington
None
company?
of the buildings are still standing that were made for the Lexington. They were on 18th Street west of Western on the north side of the street. And they ended up with several buildings, and those buildings have been taken down.
Taken down and replaced.
Yeah. One of Lexington's famous days, most famous, they were very, very successful with the Pikes Peak hill climb. And of course, Pikes Peak is in Colorado. The first one was run in 1916. They didn't run it again during World War I. So the second one was run in 1920. And there were 2 Lexingtons that were entered in that. One was driven by Loesch, who was from Cincinnati, but he came to Connersville and worked at Lexington. And he came in first. And since he was first, he got to, there's a very fancy trophy, the Penrose Trophy, and they got to have it in Connersville for the year. And then the next year, the winner of the Pikes Peak hill climb got to keep the trophy in that year. And so it was a traveling trophy. But in 1924, and that's when this picture was taken, these pictures, the Lexington won first, second, third in the Pikes Peak hill climb, and then we got to keep the trophy. It became a permanent fixture at Connersville, and that trophy is on display at the Fayette County Historical Museum.
Wow!
And
do they still do that race by any chance?
That race is still run. Now, it was run at Labor Day in September at this time, and they had some issues with snow and really some very cold weather. Nowadays, it's run, I believe, in July, and so it's run during the warmest part of the summer.
Yeah.
And so they don't have quite the issues that, so Lexington won the race, but the company was near bankruptcy at that time, and even winning the race didn't spur sales enough to really pull the company out, and they folded in 1926.
What caused them to? What was the determining factor for them to start losing sales and end up folding?
Yeah, the big factor was they were a small company competing in big business.
Yeah, Ford and GM.
And so yeah, as Model T was the king at that time, and they were building cars super cheap, and even Chevrolet and Buick and other vehicles that were turning out cars by the tens of thousands, and Lexington was trying to sell them by the thousands.
Wow.
And they just financially could not compete.
Wow. So even winning a race that's such as prestigious as, which shows the durability of their car,
right?
It couldn't, because it all came down to affording payments.
Yes.
Now, when did they start? I don't know if this is in your books or anything, but when did cars start taking payments? Because if I remember right, was Chevrolet, GM, weren't they the first company to say, okay, listen, not only will we have a car that's different color than black, but we'll also start taking payments?
Actually, in the early 1920s, Henry Ford was looking for ways to stimulate sales. Actually, there was a recession that happened late 1920 into 1921, and all of the companies were finding it more difficult to get sales. And one of the things that Henry Ford did at that time was set up a kind of a layaway plan. So you could pay like $5 a week to your Ford dealer, and then when you had completed the payments, you got your car.
Wow.
And so it was, it was not
like it is today,
a deferred payment thing.
Right.
You paid ahead.
Right.
And that really did help spur sales right at a time when it was needed. General Motors picked up on the idea and made it possible to buy the car and make payments. But it started with Ford in their layaway plan. They didn't call it layaway,
right.
but it was a way of making payments towards your Model T Ford, and when the payments had paid for the car, then you got your car.
So the Model T back then was the Rolls Royce of, I mean, if you want to call it that, or
it was a very common car.
Yeah.
The more they produced, the lower the prices were made. Right. And at one time in the mid-1920s, you could buy a brand new Model T Roadster for $265.
That's amazing.
Brand new. And of course, that didn't have some of the things that we like electric starter.
Yeah, right.
You had to crank it.
Yeah.
And it had a folding top, but no side windows. If it rained, you got wet, kind of. It did have headlights, but it was the basic transportation.
Yeah.
And it worked for people who needed a car and could buy one.
Yeah. So back then, if you wanted to get, I guess, the deluxe model, you would have windows that, would they roll down, stay up? I mean, or did they fold in and out?
Well, the open cars, the touring car, the Roadster, they did have like isinglass side windows that could be clipped into place in bad weather or cold weather. And then by the 1920s, the sedans and coupes that were enclosed became much more popular, and as it got into the 1920s, they became the most common. The prices were still considerably higher. That Ford Roadster that you could buy for $260 new, if you went to a closed car, even a coupe, the price was more like $600. So
wow.
a substantial difference in those days. But you could get that closed car, and it was still cheap compared to other cars.
Wow, it's amazing because now, the safety precautions that we have now in cars can almost drive themselves.
Oh,
it's
yes.
amazing with the, it's back then the simple transportation of just I wouldn't know what to do if I didn't have a radio or anything like that. Cars back then, they didn't even have heating or air conditioning, did they?
Well, depending on the weather, if it's cold out, you could consider it air conditioned.
Yeah.
If it was really hot out,
that'd be the heat.
You had the heat, and you had heat. A lot of heat came back from the engine anyway. You didn't have much insulation to protect you, so. Pretty much, you had basic transportation. Even the more expensive cars still didn't have the comforts that we're accustomed to.
Oh, sure.
And power steering, no, there wasn't any such thing. It was arm power.
Yeah, right.
And power brakes was leg power.
Yeah. Oh, man.
The harder you pushed on the pedal.
Yeah.
But it was still a difficult thing to drive in comparison to what we have.
How were the roads in Connersville back in the 1920s?
Well, Connersville was one of the leaders in our area with concrete streets, and we had lots of concrete streets. The downtown streets were brick. Central Avenue from like 3rd to 8th was brick, and for many years. And of course, eventually when those bricks were taken up and then paving put down, some people have still saved some of those bricks, but that was done many years ago.
We got them in our set.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
So they've saved the bricks from.
Some people did.
Yeah, well, I guess
generally it was not. They were not saved, but some of those bricks were probably used in building some of the smaller buildings around, and so there were uses made of them.
Brick roads, because I know the brick road in Oxford, are they a lot more, is there less care for the concrete and brick roads as?
They were generally put down before the concrete roads were, and I would say that in Oxford, it's probably maintained as a nostalgia thing as much as anything.
Oh, sure.
And it's kind of neat to drive over the brick streets but they take maintenance also.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. So the roads in Connersville, definitely not like we see today. The county roads probably didn't have any concrete or anything. Were they all dirt and
county
rock?
roads were generally dirt. Eventually, then they began putting gravel down, and one of the highways, the Milton Pike, or Highway 1 now. During the 1930s even, was one lane concrete and 1-lane gravel for many years. And they've said that the Auburn that was made here, and they had a supercharged Auburn Speedster. And it says here, over 100 miles per hour. And they advertised that every Auburn boat tail Speedster that was made, supercharged, would be driven over 100 miles an hour before it was delivered to the customer. And they would put a plaque on the dash to say how fast that car had been driven. And they were tested on Highway 1 north, and that was one lane concrete and 1 lane gravel. And they used to say that if you were out driving and you saw an Auburn coming towards you, you better head for the gravel.
Right. Because
if he was doing the 100-mile-an-hour test, you wanted to be out of his way.
Wow. Now, when did that car looks, I mean, that looks...
No, that's fairly modern in comparison.
Yeah,
this is 1935-36.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say.
This is kind of the Corvette of 1935-36.
Corvette. So, Connersville made obviously more than just the Lexington. Were they making any other cars at the time of the Lexington?
Well, yes. One of the ones that's I think interesting is the Empire, and this is 1913 brochure. Empire and McFarland and a number of other Indiana automobile companies made a trip from Indianapolis to Los Angeles, and it was a promotional trip. And Empire made up a booklet about their trip, and they went right along and made quite a record for themselves. They were a lightweight car, much like a Ford Model T. And some of the heavy cars would get stuck on hills and going across wooden bridges. And the Empire found that they could just go right around them and go on. And so the Empire is quite a noteworthy little car, made in Connersville from 1913, rather from 1912 through 1915.
Wow.
And we have at the museum a 1913 Empire. And it's quite a neat car. It has right-hand steering, and that's kind of a carryover from the horse and buggy days when you sat on the right-hand side when you drove the horse. This has acetylene headlamps. You light them with a match, and you don't get going too fast because you'll blow out your lights.
Yeah, right.
And it has a folding top and a bulb horn. You honk the horn by squeezing the bulb. And so this is a neat thing. Another car that was made here during that period of time was
your second book.
This is McFarland. This is my second book, and the cover on this was worked up by John Blommel, and that's kind of neat, especially because John's grandfather came to Connersville to help get the McFarland automobile worked out, some bugs, and he was kind of a mechanic, and he helped get them on the road. McFarland started in Connersville in 1856, and John McFarland came and bought a carriage manufacturing company that was already here, and he built carriages here for over 50 years. And then eventually they became automobiles, but he built all kinds of carriages, and his was noted for their quality. So he eventually became one of the leading carriage and buggy building companies in the world. And then his grandson, Harry McFarland, started the automobile line, and started in with a mid-price car, a 6-cylinder. He always made 6-cylinder cars until the very end, when they started including some 8-cylinder cars. McFarland became a very expensive car, and became one of the very elite cars. At one time was even often referred to as the Rolls-Royce of America.
That looks like it.
And they made him look like that.
Yeah.
And we have a McFarland at the museum that shows that radiator shell looking like a Rolls-Royce. And the radiator shells, they weren't just chrome-plated on a McFarland. They were German silver. And so they had a special touch. And only the very wealthy could afford them.
It looks like I can't afford it. Richard, our time is up. Can you believe it?
No.
Yeah, 30 minutes has gone by like that. Stop in and see the McFarland at the Connersville Museum. God bless everybody. We'll see you next month on the spot.
All right.